What I'm about to share with you might sound like something straight out of a tall tale, the kind of thing you'd think only happens in fiction. It's almost unbelievable, bordering on surreal, but I went through it myself, and I can tell you from personal experience that sometimes real life is far stranger than anything you'd hear in a story. I've never been the type to focus on life's curveballs. I preferred everything to be simple, predictable. I ran my household with a firm sense of structure and order, expecting the same from my wife. We each had our roles clearly laid out, and I didn't see any reason for unnecessary disruptions. Life as I knew it was simple. At least that's what I believed. Now, my wife was different. She was always on the lookout for something new to keep her occupied or add excitement to her life. She wasn't content with the usual routines, always craving something bigger, something that made her feel like she was part of a larger picture. At first, I chalked it up to her personality. She had this restless energy, this constant desire for change, which I didn't fully grasp but decided to put up with. She liked to mingle in different social circles, always trying to find her place or feel like she belonged somewhere. She was friendly enough, polite, and eager to connect with new people. I figured it was harmless, just her way of being. As long as she took care of her responsibilities at home, I had no reason to complain. But now, looking back, I can see that there was something deeper at play, a kind of emptiness she was trying to fill. She wanted to feel special, to have something interesting in her life that made her stand out from the crowd. I didn't think much of it back then, assuming it was just another phase. What would come next, though, was something I could never have anticipated. I was content with my own interests, not paying too much attention to how different we were in this aspect. But soon, I'd come to realize that this difference between us was far more significant than I had ever imagined. One evening, my wife came home from work looking unusually down. It wasn't like her, and I could immediately sense that something was weighing on her. Naturally, I asked what was wrong. She sighed, dropped her bag on the kitchen counter, and started venting about her coworkers. She told me how they all had these fascinating hobbies. Some played tennis, others were into golf, and a few even did pottery. They always had stories to share, talking about their weekends or the new skills they were learning. She explained that she felt out of place, like she didn't have anything of her own to contribute. I listened to them, and sure, I get interested, I even feel comfortable around them, but I want more than that, she said. I want to be the one with something interesting to talk about for once. She kept going, saying she wanted a hobby of her own, something that would make her feel more alive. She didn't want to just pick up what her coworkers were doing. She wanted something different. At first, I listened with mild indifference. In my experience, trouble always seemed to start the same way, with a woman sitting around, bored, with too much time on her hands. I figured this was just another one of those situations. But to be fair, I didn't brush her off. She seemed genuinely bothered, so I nodded and told her we'd figure something out. After all, it wouldn't hurt to explore a few ideas if it might help lift her spirits. Deep down, though, I already suspected that finding this perfect hobby wouldn't be a simple task. I'd seen her enthusiasm for things fizzle out quickly before, as she bounced from one interest to another. But this time, there was a different intensity about her, like she truly needed something to hold on to. So I decided to humor her. Maybe it would be good for her to have something to focus on for a change. I told her I'd ask around, see if any of my friends or colleagues had any suggestions, and we could also search online for ideas. She seemed relieved that I was on board and willing to help. I think she believed that my willingness to help meant I truly understood what she was feeling. But if I'm being honest, I just wanted her to find something so I wouldn't have to hear her complain about it anymore. Keeping the peace was just easier that way. As I watched her that night, I couldn't help but wonder if this was another passing phase or if she genuinely felt adrift. Either way, I figured it was worth trying to find her something to occupy her time. After all, if she had her own hobbies, she'd be less likely to stir up trouble or bring that restless energy into our home. So, I took it upon myself to help her find this new passion she was so determined to have. At work, during lunch or coffee breaks, I started asking the guys if they or their wives had any interesting hobbies. I wasn't exactly used to these kinds of conversations, but I figured it was worth the effort if it meant getting her off my case. Some of them mentioned things like fishing, painting, or even learning to play an instrument. I mentally noted all the suggestions, thinking I'd pass them on to her later. In the evenings, we sat down together and went through some of the options. We even checked online for classes and activities nearby. I've got to admit, it felt strange, sitting there browsing through listings for pottery workshops, yoga sessions, and cooking classes. None of that stuff was my cup of tea, and frankly, I didn't care for it at all. But she seemed optimistic, and I was determined to help her find something that would keep her occupied. In my mind, a busy wife was a happy wife, or at least that's what I believed. Eventually, we signed her up for a few classes. One of them was a pottery workshop that a few of the guys' wives had recommended. At first, she seemed excited about it. She attended the classes, came home talking about how calming it was to work with clay, and even brought back a few pieces she'd made. I thought to myself, well, maybe this will keep her satisfied for a while. And for a time, things were fine. She seemed content, and I figured we'd finally found something that worked. But, just as I had half expected, her interest started to fizzle out. One evening, she came home with a sigh and admitted that pottery wasn't really what she was looking for after all. She said it felt like she was just doing what everyone else was doing, something ordinary. She wanted something more unique, something that would really make her stand out. That's when I knew we were back to square one. All that effort, and we were still no closer to finding what she really wanted. Not one to give up easily, I kept suggesting other options, a painting class, some local hiking groups. She gave those a shot too. At first, she'd come home with stories, telling me how great it was. But then, as always, the excitement faded, and she'd hit me with the same line. It's just not it. At that point, I was starting to get frustrated. It seemed like no matter what we tried, nothing could satisfy her. Still, I kept pushing forward, determined to find something that would finally capture her interest. In my mind, it was just a matter of time before she either found what she was looking for or realized this endless search for something unique wasn't going to bring her the satisfaction she craved. Either way, I was committed to seeing this through, if only to put an end to the constant complaints. Now, I've never been one to dive into hobbies like she did. I had my own way of unwinding, playing video games with my buddies, grabbing a drink at the bar once in a while, or catching a game on TV. It was simple and it worked for me. I didn't feel the need to impress anyone or pick up some activity just to stand out. I was content with what I had, and I never felt that urge to be more interesting or unique. That just wasn't how I operated. One night, I was casually scrolling through TikTok, something I occasionally did when I didn't have much else going on. I wasn't searching for anything in particular, just passing the time. As I flicked through the usual barrage of random videos, one clip grabbed my attention. A woman riding a horse to the tune of "Be My Lover." It was captivating, the way she moved with such grace, perfectly in sync with the rhythm. I paused, watching as she rode with a sense of confidence, the horse responding to her every move like they were one. It looked exhilarating, and I thought to myself, now, that's something different. An idea started brewing in my mind. I knew my wife had been desperate for something unique and exciting, and this seemed like just the thing she might be after. Horseback riding wasn't something you came across every day, and it certainly wasn't in the same category as tennis or pottery. It had an edge to it, a thrill that might give her that excitement she'd been craving. I figured it was worth suggesting. When I mentioned it to her, her face lit up. Her eyes grew wide with curiosity, and she leaned in, eager to hear more. I told her about the video, describing how alive the woman seemed, riding with such confidence and style. My wife was hooked right away. "That's exactly what I've been looking for," she said, her excitement spilling over. She didn't waste a second before pulling out her phone and looking up horseback riding lessons in our area. For the first time in a long while, it felt like we might have stumbled onto something that would actually stick. Within a few days, she found a place that offered lessons and signed up immediately. She was more enthusiastic than I'd seen her in years, constantly talking about how different it was from everything else she'd tried. She couldn't wait to share it with her coworkers, already imagining how they'd react to her latest venture. I thought, well, maybe we finally hit the mark this time. It felt good to see her so energized, even though I didn't quite understand the appeal myself. I wasn't sure how long her excitement would last, but for once, I was hopeful. At least horseback riding had that spark of excitement and uniqueness she'd been searching for, and I figured anything was better than her moping around. If it kept her occupied and happy, it was worth the effort. I watched her head off to her first lesson, thinking maybe this would finally be the thing to calm her restless spirit. When she returned from that first lesson, the level of enthusiasm on her face was something I hadn't seen in a long time. She was absolutely glowing, bursting with excitement. From the moment she walked through the door, she couldn't stop talking. She went on and on about how incredible it felt to ride, how powerful and free she felt up there on the horse. She described the sensation of the horse moving beneath her, the thrill of the wind in her face, and how it was a completely new experience. Exactly what she had been craving. She told me how supportive and impressed her colleagues had been when she mentioned she'd taken up horseback riding. Their reactions were all positive, telling her how adventurous and bold she was for choosing something so different from the usual hobbies. She seemed genuinely happy that she had found something that set her apart, something that made her stand out in her group. She even said it felt good to be the one with the exciting story to tell for a change. For the next few weeks, horseback riding was all she could talk about. Every time she came home from a lesson, she was eager to share every single detail. How she was learning to control the horse, the new techniques the instructor was teaching her, and even how she was starting to bond with the animal. She was absolutely buzzing with excitement, telling story after story about her lessons. Even though I wasn't all that interested, I nodded along. As long as she was happy and engaged, that was enough for me. A month went by, and her enthusiasm didn't fade in the slightest. Unlike all the hobbies she'd tried before, this one seemed to stick. She was genuinely committed, always counting down the days until her next lesson. It got to the point where it felt like she was becoming a bit obsessed, with her whole schedule starting to revolve around those lessons. I started to think that maybe we'd finally found something that would last. She even began buying new gear, riding boots, a helmet, all the stuff she said she needed. I didn't mind. If it kept her excited and motivated, it was worth it. Besides, she seemed more confident, more alive than I'd seen her in a long time. For a moment, I thought maybe this was what she'd been missing all along, what she needed to feel complete. It was just nice to see her in such good spirits again. I felt relieved to have some peace in the house, without her complaining about boredom or feeling left out. I didn't fully get the appeal of riding, but as long as it kept her happy and occupied, I was more than willing to support it. For now, it seemed like horseback riding was exactly what she'd been searching for. One evening, my wife went out to meet up with a friend of hers. They got together fairly often just to chat, catch up, and gossip about whatever it is women talk about. I didn't pay much attention to these get-togethers. It was just part of her usual routine. But that night, she sent me a text out of the blue. It said, "I have something to tell you later, you won't believe it." I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I didn't give it much thought at the time. I assumed it was just some silly story she'd heard from her friend. When she got home, she was practically bursting, like she was holding in the punchline to a joke she couldn't wait to tell me. She kicked off her shoes and dove straight into it, barely pausing to catch her breath. She told me her friend had recently bought a dildo, but not just any kind, one shaped like a horse's genitals. She went on to emphasize how huge it was, using her hands to show the size, and laughed about how absurd the whole thing seemed. She said her friend had shown it to her as a joke, and they both had a good laugh over it, wondering who on earth would even buy something like that. "It's crazy, right?" she said, still giggling. "Who actually uses these things?" She seemed genuinely amused by the situation, treating it like just some outrageous bit of humor between friends. I couldn't help but chuckle along, though mine was more out of awkwardness than anything else. It was definitely one of the stranger conversations we'd had, even for her. I made a quick joke to keep things light, saying something like, "Well, that's wild. Some people are really into the weirdest stuff." I didn't think much of it beyond that. In my mind, it was just another odd thing that people do, nothing to do with us. We laughed it off and I moved on, not giving it a second thought. After all, what did it have to do with us? It was just another strange story from her friend. She kept talking about it for a few more minutes, still laughing, but I noticed there was a hint of fascination behind her amusement. She even asked me if I could imagine anyone actually using something like that. I shrugged and told her it was beyond me. People are strange, I said, keeping my tone casual. As far as I was concerned, it was just a weird conversation topic that would be forgotten by morning. Once the laughter settled down, we moved on to other things, and I didn't dwell on the story afterward. To me, it was nothing more than a harmless joke between friends, not worth overthinking. In my mind, it was just another sign of how far people were willing to go these days for a thrill. I had no idea that this seemingly harmless conversation would take on a whole new meaning later. But at the time, I had no reason to suspect anything was off. Not long after that talk, I started noticing a shift in my wife's behavior. She began spending more time at the stables, staying later than she used to. At first, I didn't think much of it. She was passionate about her new hobby, and it seemed natural for her to want to dive in deeper. But after a while, the frequency and length of her visits started standing out to me. She'd tell me she was staying behind to help out or get in some extra practice, but something about how she said it didn't sit right with me. I tried to ask her about her lessons, like I always did, but her responses became shorter, less enthusiastic. Before, she couldn't wait to tell me all the little details about her progress or the horses she was working with. Now, she'd just shrug and say it was fine or that it was the usual. It was as if she didn't want to talk about it anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something, and that unease began to gnaw at me. I couldn't help but consider the possibility that maybe she had met someone at the stables, another rider, or maybe even one of the instructors. I'd seen it happen before, where people get wrapped up in a new hobby, meet someone who shares their passion, and things take off from there. At the time, it was the only explanation that made sense to me. If she was acting distant and secretive, it had to mean she was keeping something from me. I wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but the signs were all there, and it was becoming harder to ignore them. I kept these thoughts to myself, but I began watching her more closely. She was always on her phone when she got home, and she seemed distracted, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. It felt like she was slipping away, and I hated the feeling of being left in the dark. I was suspicious, but I didn't want to act on just a hunch. If there was something going on, I needed real proof, not just a gut feeling. So I came up with a plan. One evening, when she told me she'd be staying late at the stables again, I decided to drive over there myself. Of course, I didn't tell her. I wanted to see for myself what was really going on. If she was hiding something or someone, I was going to find out. I figured I'd park a little ways off and quietly walk over. It seemed like the only way to confirm my suspicions. The whole situation felt absurd. I never imagined I'd be the kind of guy who had to check up on his own wife, but her behavior had left me no choice. I needed to know if my instincts were right. If she was being unfaithful, at least I'd have the truth, and I could decide where to go from there. With that in mind, I headed out that evening, determined to finally get to the bottom of what was really happening at the stables. When I arrived, I parked the car a bit away from the entrance to avoid being noticed. I got out and quietly made my way over, staying in the shadows as much as I could. The place was dimly lit, with only a few lights on, and the quiet was broken only by the occasional rustle of hay or the sound of a horse shifting in its stall. My heart was racing, and my mind was swirling with all kinds of possibilities. I braced myself to see her with someone else, preparing for the worst. But nothing could have prepared me for what I actually found. As I got closer, I heard faint noises coming from one of the stalls. My pulse quickened as I moved in, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I walked slowly, careful to stay as quiet as possible until I could see clearly, and that's when I saw her. She was completely naked, standing beside the horse. I froze, unable to process what was right in front of me. She was touching the animal in ways that made my skin crawl, her hands moving with a familiarity I couldn't comprehend. She pressed herself against the horse, and I felt my stomach turn. It was grotesque, surreal, something I couldn't have even dreamed up in my worst nightmares. My eyes widened, and I stood there, paralyzed, unable to react. All I could think was how much easier it would have been if it had been a lover. That, at least, would have made sense, something I could deal with rationally. But this This was beyond any kind of reasoning. A wave of disgust and anger started boiling inside me. I couldn't hold back any longer. I stepped forward and shouted her name, my voice echoing through the silent stable. She jumped, startled, and immediately scrambled to cover herself, grabbing for her clothes in a panic. "This isn't what it looks like," she yelled, her voice trembling. I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew she'd been caught in something unspeakable, but I wasn't about to listen to her excuses. There was no explanation that could make sense of this. No words would ever justify what I had just seen. I didn't say another word. I just turned and started walking back to the car, my steps heavy with a mix of rage and revulsion. I could hear her calling after me, pleading, trying to explain herself, but it was too late. I didn't care what she had to say. Nothing could change what I had just witnessed. That image was burned into my mind, and I knew there was no coming back from this. By the time I reached the car, my hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I could still hear her shouting in the distance, but I didn't look back. I got into the car, slammed the door, and sped off. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get as far away from that scene as possible. There was no coming back from this. When I finally made it home, I was seething. I couldn't think straight. My mind was just a whirlwind of rage. The only thing I knew for certain was that she needed to be out of the house. I went straight to our bedroom and started throwing her things into bags. Clothes, shoes, anything that belonged to her. I wasn't concerned about making a mess. I just wanted every trace of her gone. The anger that had been building on the drive home wasn't fading, and seeing her stuff scattered around only fueled it more. Not long after, I heard her car pull up. I knew she had followed me back, but I didn't stop. She rushed inside, her face pale and filled with panic. "What are you doing?" she shouted, but I didn't even acknowledge her. I kept tossing her things out, one bag after another, my mind set on one goal: getting her out of my sight. The image of what I'd seen at the stables was still fresh in my head, and just looking at her made me sick. She tried to explain, reaching out to grab my arm. "Wait, listen. It's not what you think," she said, desperation thick in her voice. "It's a procedure for the horse. They needed it for breeding." I stopped for a second, staring at her, and let out a bitter, disbelieving laugh. "And you had to be naked for that?" I asked, my voice cold and sharp. Her explanation was absurd, and the fact that she was even trying to justify it only made me angrier. She dropped her gaze, her eyes darting around as she searched for the right words. "I thought it would be easier that way," she said in a quiet voice, like even she knew how ridiculous it sounded. "It's supposed to help calm the horse." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was like she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince me. I shook my head, my hands clenching into fists, feeling the anger rising up again. "You expect me to believe that? You really think I'm that stupid?" I shoved past her, tossing another bag of her stuff onto the floor. "I don't know what's worse," I yelled, my voice rising with each word. "The fact that you did that, or the fact that you're standing here lying to my face." She started crying, but it didn't move me. Her tears meant absolutely nothing in that moment. All I could think about was how twisted the whole situation was, and how she had managed to drag me into it. She kept pleading, saying she didn't know what else to do, that she panicked when I walked in. "I didn't want you to see me like that," she stammered, as if that was supposed to make a difference. But it didn't. It was far too late for that. I'd already seen everything, and there was no way to unsee it. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare, one I couldn't escape from no matter how hard I tried. The more she tried to explain, the angrier I became. Her words felt like nothing more than pathetic excuses, and none of them made what she did any less horrifying. I continued packing her things, ignoring her sobs, and pushing her hands away whenever she tried to grab my arm. At that point, I was done listening. I didn't care what she had to say anymore. She had crossed a line that could never be undone. She had betrayed me in a way I never even imagined possible. I stopped for a moment, standing there, staring at her, feeling nothing but pure rage and disgust. The words tumbled out of my mouth before I even realized I was saying them. "How could you betray me like that? With a horse of all things?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the room. It sounded ridiculous even as I said it, but the reality was far worse than the words. "You chose a horse over your own husband. Do you even hear how insane that sounds?" She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. There was no sense to be made from any of it. She tried to come closer, reaching out as if to touch me, but I took a step back, refusing to let her near. "Don't even try," I snapped, locking eyes with her. "You think you can just explain this away? There's nothing you can say that will make this okay." Her tears flowed harder now, and she kept shaking her head, muttering that it wasn't what it looked like. But it was too late for that. I had seen it with my own eyes, and nothing she said was going to change that. "How could you choose something like that over me?" I demanded, my voice getting louder. "I've heard of cheating, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined." My hands were shaking with anger, fists clenched tight as I fought to keep my composure. "You humiliated me in a way I can't even describe. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I saw the guilt and fear in her eyes, but it didn't matter anymore. There was no coming back from this. She kept insisting it was just a procedure, that it was for the horse's sake and nothing more. But her words sounded hollow, like she was grasping for any excuse she could find. "That's your excuse?" I shot back, my voice dripping with disbelief. "You had to do this for the horse? And being naked was somehow necessary?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The more she spoke, the angrier I became. It was insulting, the way she was trying to make it sound innocent when it was anything but. At that point, all I wanted was to get her out of my sight. "I don't want to hear any more lies," I said, my tone cold and final. "Pack your things and leave. Now." She started pleading again, trying to tell me she could explain everything. But I was done. I wasn't going to stand there and listen to another word of her nonsense. The betrayal cut too deep, and there was no way to fix what had been broken. I shoved her bags into her hands as she cried, still trying to get me to listen. "You traded me for a horse?" I said, shaking my head in disbelief. "Just think about that. You threw away our marriage for something that doesn't even make sense." The bitterness in my voice was hard to ignore, and I could hardly believe I had to say those words. But they were the truth, and there was no escaping it. As I pushed her toward the door, she turned back, still crying, still reaching out. "Please let me explain," she begged. But I didn't give her the chance. "It's over," I said, slamming the door behind her. "You made your choice." The house felt empty, cold, as I stood there listening to her footsteps fade away. The reality of what had just happened was still sinking in, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. What she had done was beyond reason, and I knew that no explanation she could offer would change that. The divorce process was as cold and detached as I expected it to be. Once I made it clear there was no going back, we started the legal formalities. I called a lawyer the very next day, determined to get the process over with as quickly as possible. There was no point in dragging it out. I had seen what I saw, and there was no point in pretending reconciliation was on the table. It felt like we had become strangers, two people who no longer shared any connection. She tried to reach out a few times, sending texts and asking if we could talk, but I ignored her. There was nothing left to say. The betrayal had cut too deep, and I had no interest in hearing any more excuses. My lawyer made it clear that keeping things simple would be best. No scenes, no unnecessary complications, and I agreed. The quicker we could end things, the better it would be for both of us. We filed for a no-fault divorce, and the paperwork went through smoothly. There were no children involved, so we didn't have to deal with custody battles or anything like that. All we had to do was divide our assets, which didn't take much effort. She had already moved out, taking most of her belongings with her. We came to an agreement on the house and our savings without much argument. She seemed to want a quiet exit, and for that I was grateful. The whole situation was humiliating enough. The last thing I needed was to make it public. Throughout the process, I kept the real reason for our divorce to myself. I didn't tell my friends or colleagues the details, just that we had grown apart. It was easier that way. I didn't need their pity or judgment. More than that, I didn't want to ruin her reputation. As much as she had hurt me, I saw no point in tearing her life apart even further. Maybe, one day, she'd reflect on her actions and understand the consequences of her choices. After the divorce was finalized, I focused on moving forward. I threw myself into my work, kept up with my usual routines, and spent more time with friends. I stayed busy, trying not to dwell on what had happened. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the memory of what I saw would come flooding back, and I'd feel that familiar wave of disgust wash over me. But I did my best to push it aside. She was no longer a part of my life, and that chapter was firmly closed. As for her, I had no idea how she was doing. She moved to a different part of the city, and we had no contact after that. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was trying to piece her life back together, but I never asked for details. I didn't care to know. As far as I was concerned, we were done, and it was best to keep it that way. In the end, I knew the divorce was the right decision. It allowed us both to move on, even if it meant going our separate ways. She made her choice and I made mine. After everything that happened, it was clear we weren't meant to be together. Maybe someday, she'd look back on her actions and learn from them. But for now, our paths had diverged, and I had no intention of ever looking back.